When Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, this, of course, is going to cause a great deal of tension, to put it mildly. And so we see Austria-Hungary, who was really kind of looking for the opportunity to go after Serbia. They declare war on Serbia. In a week, almost all of Europe was then engaged in the fight. Again, thinking about the different causes of the war, the major ism sort of leading to war was nationalism, these feelings of superiority of others. But the alliance system is what would cause everyone to sort of be obligated to fight at this point. Russia's foreign minister is reputed to have said to Austria-Hungary, "You are setting fire to Europe." In backing Austria-Hungary, Germany had to fight on two sides, against France on the west and Russia on the east. So this is not good. And so Germany begins war preparations very, very quickly. So in July, we have Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Germany all either declaring war or mobilizing for war or preparing for war. The next month, France and Germany both order mobilization, Germany declaring war on Russia and France, and then Britain declaring war on Germany. So, Germany's plan for surviving a two-front war was known as the Schlieffen Plan. The plan was to focus most of its fighting on France. So in our little map here, Germany's represented in green. The idea was start off by focusing the vast majority of our forces through Belgium, which was neutral, and get into France, to take France out quickly, and then turn around, move towards the east to take care of the slow-moving Russians, or at least what they thought were slow-moving Russians. When German troops violated Belgian neutrality in order to attack France, Great Britain, that's when Great Britain declared war on Germany. Turkey and Bulgaria soon joined Germany and Austria, making them the Central Powers. At first, Italy was a part of the German alliance, but Italy then decided at the beginning of the war that Austria violated neutrality, so Italy joined France and Britain because they were promised better spoils of war. And this side, once again, is called the Allies. At first, the German Schlieffen Plan worked, but various circumstances began to hurt the Germans' assault. At the Battle of the Marne, for 7 days, the Allies fought pretty hard and eventually were able to push the Germans back. At this point, the German army was really stretched to the limit and was fighting a war on two fronts, which was exactly what they were trying to avoid. The Russians arrived on the Eastern Front a lot more quickly than what they expected, and this was not good. So how do we get out of this? Well, during this time, we quickly see the development of trench warfare. Armies dug trenches and lined the front of them with heavy razor wire, with barbed wire, which worked fairly well for defense, but offensively, the war reached a stalemate very, very quickly. The space between the trenches was called no man's land because it was highly likely that any man sent out of the trench would be shot down. No man basically could survive in the section of land between the two trenches. The average life expectancy of a soldier in the trenches was probably about 2 months. Some of them made it out throughout the entire war, but those were fairly few and far between. Probably the one thing that made this the war to end all wars, as it's called, was the amount of dead soldiers. So many quotes from people that continuously describe the stench of death which filled the air. If you've already read Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est, he talks about his experience there. The trenches barely ever moved at all, making them basically like open graves for soldiers. You also have to imagine that, you know, inside the trenches, you don't have a latrine, right? You don't really have a restroom. So human waste is filling the trenches just as much as whatever food, you know, stuff is left over, dead bodies. this is not a nice place to be. So we're stuck in the trench, and you can see this is sort of an example of the earlier trenches. These are very small places. We're crunched in together. My best friend just died, and he's lying right next to me. His dead body is lying next to me. And if I try to get him out, somebody on the other side can shoot me because they'll see me getting out of the trench. So this is just a horrible experience. This is industrialized warfare, probably at its worst. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers lost their lives between 1914 and 1916. Occasionally, soldiers would call a truce, and they would either talk a while with each other or allow the dead to be carried away from no man's land. But finally, commanders and troops agreed to stop offensive assaults only at certain times in order to cross no man's land, in order to get dead bodies from there. Due to the great technological advancement during this time, there were many new weapons introduced during the war, helping to increase the number of casualties. I'm sure you can imagine. Poison gas was introduced, so you can see in this photograph, this guy is wearing a gas mask, and he's getting ready to throw a grenade. A lot of these are not necessarily new in the sense of this isn't the first time people thought of using poison gas or bombs or things like that. It's just that, once again, now they are industrialized, and we've found new chemicals and new substances that can be used other than like oil that's set on fire that you throw in a catapult, you know, across a wall to start burning down a city. Now we've got something that can actually, you know, fully explode. And there's shrapnel, and there's all sorts of stuff, right? Tanks, airplanes, flamethrowers, submarines, new warships, all of these are the biggest inventions. In the East, Germany had to consistently fight off the Russians because, again, the Russians just keep coming. They have a huge area of land to pull people from to fight. Now, even though the Russians were disorganized, they were undisciplined, they lacked good leadership, they were able to keep the Germans occupied for quite a long while, ultimately weakening the German army rather quickly. As the first Christmas began to approach, we see months beforehand millions of servicemen and volunteers from all over the continent. They were rushing happily and enthusiastically to war. The atmosphere was one of a celebration rather than of a conflict. Confetti falling from the sky and soldiers marching out and right. And everybody believed that the war was going to be done by Christmas. Everybody said, you know, the war's going to be over by Christmas. We're all going to be back home. And that just simply did not happen. With trench and industrialized warfare, the man at the front couldn't help but have a degree of sympathy for his opponents, who were experiencing just as much a miserable time as they were, and the war's not going to be over. We're stuck. So animosity began to break down as the first Christmas approached. In 1914, the year that the war starts, we see the men at the front could still see civilization. They could still see villages, although, you know, bashed up a little bit, they're still standing. There were fields which had, you know, big holes in them from bombs, but they weren't completely muddied landscapes. So the other world, the civilian world, the morality of society, you know, manners, all that went with it, it was still present on the front lines. They haven't gone through an entire year of war just yet. So that hatred that one might develop for an enemy, it's not necessarily there. So we see a desire, even on all sides, to see the enemy up close. So was he really as bad as what the leaders were telling them? So a combination of these factors and others made the Christmas truce of 1914 possible. Along the front, the enemy was sometimes no more than like 70 yards away. Both British and German soldiers, they would sometimes call the British Tommy, and the Germans they would call Fritz. They could very easily hurl greetings and insults to one another, just as easily as they could throw a bomb, and they could come to agreements not to fire. And incidents of temporary truces and even fraternization were more common at this stage in the war than many people today realize. So as Christmas approached, we see, the celebratory mood, the festive mood and desire for a lull in the fighting increased as packages with goodies from home start to arrive on the front. So with their morale sort of boosted by messages of thanks, their bellies are fuller than normal, and they have so much stuff again that been sent from home to hand out and to share. We see a season of goodwill in the trenches. And one part of the line, the Germans had managed to slip a chocolate cake into the British trenches. So they're sharing things back and forth. But even more amazing than that was that the cake carried a message with it asking for a ceasefire later that evening so that they could celebrate the season and also their captain's birthday. They proposed a concert at 7:30 in the evening when candles, the British were told, would be placed on the highest, most parts of the trenches. And the British accepted the invitation, offering some tobacco in return as a present in kind. And that evening, at the stated time, German heads started popping up out of the trenches, and they started to sing. And each side, every time a number ended, there would be applause from both sides. Now, the British commander started issuing very stern orders. Don't do that. But, of course, they kept doing it. So, a lot of high-ranking officers were kind of like, well, one author says that if anything, they believed it would at least offer their men an opportunity to strengthen their trenches. Christmas Day began rather quietly, but once the sun was up, the fraternization actually began. Songs were sung, people were throwing rations to each other, and it was not long before troops and officers started to take matters into their own hands and started walking into no man's land, which became something sort of a playground. Men started exchanging gifts and buttons. In one or two places, soldiers who had been barbers in civilian times gave free haircuts. One German, who was a juggler and a showman, gave an impromptu and surreal performance of his routine in the middle of no man's land. On many parts of the line, the Christmas Day truce was initiated through some sadder means. Both sides saw the lull as a chance to get into no man's land to get the bodies of those who had died, to give them a decent burial. Now, once this was done, the opponents would inevitably begin talking to each other. And again, most officers didn't really try to stop it. But we see instances of, so this picture over here on the far right, this is a picture of the two sides. You've got Germans and the British who are playing soccer with each other. And here is a photograph of those with the pointy helmets. Those are the Germans. Those with the flat hats, those are the Brits. And they're exchanging gifts. Look at this. They're talking to each other. And they're exchanging things back and forth with each other. So the Christmas truce, not necessarily the biggest event of the war, but I bring it out just to show, like, this is one of the last times we see armies doing this. In the evening, around about 8:30, we see a British soldier firing 3 shots in the air, and they put a flag up that said "Merry Christmas" on it. And he climbed up on the top on the highest part, the parapet of the trench, and the Germans put up a sheet that said "Thank you." And the German captain went up on his parapet, and they bowed to each other, they saluted, and then they went back down into their trenches. The German then fired 2 shots in the air, and the war was basically on again. So again, this is not necessarily one of the major events of the war. But I bring it out because, again, I see World War I as the time in which people begin to start turning away from basic morality and common decency, but most especially, they start turning away from God most assuredly. It's very difficult to walk into a place like what these men experienced, seeing the slaughter that could happen on such a mass scale, and walk away from it praising God. And we struggle with that question, don't we? We struggle with wondering, if God is so good, then why would he allow such bad to happen? I would say maybe we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the question is, since God is so good, why does he allow so much good to happen to creatures who are so bad? God did not cause World War I. God did not bring about the bombs and the gas and all of that. Like, he didn't make all of that. Those are human beings making these things in order to hurt human beings. So, you know, this definitely is a question that's ongoing, and I hope and I pray that you will ask God. Go ahead and ask God. Be willing to ask him, because God is good, God is gracious, and he is faithful, and he will answer your questions. He can handle those questions because he's God. So, thank you for letting me share. I do have a video here, but I don't know that it's going to come up. Perhaps it'll come up on yours. But let's talk about total war. Total war is war taken from the battlefield and carried to the enemy's home front. Okay, this is it's not just on the battlefield. It's now in your city. The Germans began total war with their Zeppelin raids. Zeppelins were these huge airships. We might know them as blimps, right? Huge airships. And they were capable of traveling about 85 miles per hour and carrying somewhere around about 2 tons of explosives on bombing raids. And they went to the cities of Liège, Antwerp, and Paris. On January 19th, 1915, the Zeppelins struck Great Britain for the first time, dropping bombs on the towns of Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn. With the targeting of civilian populations from the air, modern warfare ultimately arrived. According to German Zeppelin Corps Commander Peter Strasser, he said, "Nowadays there is no such animal as a non-combatant, or somebody who doesn't fight, someone that you would not go after. Modern warfare is total warfare." Germany hoped that the bombing of Britain would spark such fear that it would force the country out of the war. The military ramped up Zeppelin production to the point that Germany ceased production of sausage, which was kind of big to their diet, right? I mean, this is a huge thing to stop. But why did they do that? Why do I bring that up? Because it was the intestinal linings of cows that were used to make the leak-proof hydrogen chambers, the leak-proof balloon, as it were. That's the lining of cow's intestines. And the lining of cow's intestines was used in sausage skins. So the Germans had to do without sausage, or at least without a great deal of it, in order to make these Zeppelins. And in fact, 250,000 cows were needed to build one Zeppelin. So kind of a big deal. Now, how are you going to take down a craft that is leak-proof, right? How are we going to do that? Well, September 8th, 1915, we see the British coming in, and they have new bullets that can not only penetrate the balloon itself, but they once they have hit, they will ignite inside the balloon. And this is new technology. It doesn't always work, but it starts to it definitely once they do work, they take out the Zeppelins very quickly, because hydrogen is highly flammable. Hydrogen is highly flammable, and so when you have bullets that are igniting inside, a Zeppelin's going to go down fairly quickly. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 was the longest single battle of World War I. The attack on Verdun, which the Germans codenamed Judgment, came about because of a plan by the German Chief of General Staff who wanted to, quote, bleed France white by launching a massive German attack on a narrow stretch of land that had historic sentiment for the French. The area around Verdun contained 20 major forts and 40 smaller ones that had historically protected the eastern border of France, and they had been modernized in the early years of the 20th century. 140,000 German troops started the attack. They were supported by 1,200 artillery guns that carried over 2 million shells and ultimately shot those shells in the Verdun region. 1,300 ammunition trains were needed to supply the guns. That's a lot. The Germans also had complete air supremacy because they had 168 planes located in the area, which was the largest concentration of planes in history up to that point. To start with, the French only had 30,000 troops to oppose the Germans, and on the day the battle started, 1,000 German artillery guns fired on a 6-mile line along the French front. The German attack and the subsequent battle lasted over 300 days. Flamethrowers were used in large numbers for the first time in order to help the Germans advance the 8 miles needed in order to capture Verdun. By February 25th, the Germans captured 10,000 French prisoners. Or by that day, not on that day. So by that day, they'd captured 10,000 French prisoners. Remember how many the French started off with? 30,000. They've lost a third of their force. To the Germans' astonishment, the huge fort, considered to be the most powerful fort in the world, was manned by just 56 old guys, elderly part-time gunners. But they gave the German attackers very little resistance. The French put General Philippe Pétain in charge of the defense of Verdun, and he was faced with an extremely difficult situation, obviously. There's only one road into Verdun from the outside, and in fact, it was barely a road. It was about 20 feet wide, and vehicles could barely pass one another. But along this road, 25,000 tons of supplies were moved into Verdun, and 90,000 soldiers. 6,000 vehicles were then used to help with this task, and it's said that about 66% of the French army was to pass up this road at some time during the battle in order to save Verdun. The Germans began to suffer huge losses. By the end of April, the Germans had lost 120,000 men, and the French 130,000 men. The rumblings of discontent in the French army came about in the summer of 1916, and they were talking about mutiny. They wanted to rise up and stop it, right? On June 1st, Germany launched a massive attack at Verdun, and by June 23rd, they got within 2.5 miles of Verdun itself. But this attack faltered as the German army had given basically all that it had, and it had nothing left to give. On June 24th, just a few days, just a few weeks afterwards, the bombardment on the Somme could be heard at Verdun. And with days, the battle at the Somme would dominate military planners on the Western Front. The Battle of Verdun, however, would continue until December. Ironically so, after the Battle of the Somme was considered to have ended. So the loss of life and those wounded was massive at Verdun. Reference books frequently give differing figures because of the magnitude of the loss. It's probable that an accurate figure will never be known, but it is said that the French lost over 360,000 people. The Germans nearly 340,000 people. To relieve the pressure being felt by the French, the British launched the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, and it was hoped that a swift British victory would force the Germans to remove troops from the Verdun area. But, like the French, the British got involved in a battle that would last months rather than days. This seems to be a continuing problem with this war. Everybody thinks things are going to get done sooner rather than later. No. So the Battle of the Somme was an offensive that was planned late in 1915 and intended as a joint French-British attack. The French commander conceived the idea as a battle of attrition, the aim being to drain the German forces of reserves, although territorial gain was a secondary aim. The German Verdun offensive transformed the intent of the Somme attack. The French demanded that the planned date of the attack, August 1st, 1916, be brought forward to July 1st, the aim chiefly being to divert German resources from Verdun in the defense of the Somme. The attack was preceded by an 8-day, so a week-long, plus a day, preliminary bombardment of German lines beginning on Saturday, June 24th. So if the idea was, if the bombardment was enough, the British would be able to get through. However, there's always a however here, right? However, the advanced artillery bombardment failed to destroy either the German front line barbed wire or the concrete bunkers the Germans had very carefully constructed. Much of the munitions used by the British proved to be duds. They didn't work. They were badly built. They were ineffective. Many charges didn't go off. And even today, farmers of the Western Front unearth many tons of unexploded bombs each year. During the bombardment, the German troops sought effective shelter in concrete bunkers, emerging when the British artillery bombardment stopped. So let's hide, and then let's come out, and that's basically what happened. So then the German machine guns were manned to great effect as a consequence of the lack of surprise generated by the advanced bombardment and the lack of success in cutting the German barbed wire and in damaging their underground bunkers. The British made very little progress on July 1st or in the days and weeks to follow. The British troops were for the most part forced back into their trenches by the effectiveness of the German machine gun response. Many troops were killed or wounded the moment they stepped out of the front lines into no man's land. Many men walked slowly towards the German lines, laden down with supplies, expecting little or no opposition. Remember, they've done this 8-day bombardment. They think that they've taken them out, but they haven't. And that made for, very easy targets for the German machine gunners. Despite the slow, although progressive, British advance, poor weather, snow in particular, brought a halt to the Somme offensive on November 18th. During the attack, the British and the French had gained about 12 kilometers of ground, the taking of which resulted in 420,000 estimated British casualties, plus a further 200,000 French casualties. And the German casualties were estimated to run around 500,000. So while the Battle of Verdun was the longest single battle of World War I, the Battle of the Somme was the deadliest. So let's stop there for now, and we will pick up and finish World War I in the next lecture.